Mr. Sikand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is going to be directed towards Air Transat. I was on a flight once from California that had to declare an emergency landing in Arizona because the air conditioning stopped working. It got so hot in there that the pilots actually couldn't operate the plane anymore. So I can actually attest to how unbearable that situation is. So when I hear passengers stuck on a plane for over 6 hours, I can tell you unequivocally that that's not acceptable, especially if they have to call 911 to get water. This isn't a forum to do an investigation or talk about tariffs, so I'm actually going to just ask you the same question I asked the other air carriers, and that's whether you understand why passengers are frustrated with the level of service they sometimes receive from your airline, and why they may feel powerless or lacking rights.
Thank you, Mr. Sikand, for that question. First and foremost, we'll state the obvious. This was an extremely unfortunate incident. We obviously regretted what happened here. We are a proud airline with 30 years of service to Canada and Canadians. We've won numerous international awards for our service. This is not the way we wanted things to turn out. We've apologized to our passengers. We are working actively and transparently with the CTA public inquiry into this matter. As you know, they held public hearings a few weeks ago, and we told our version of events there. So I don't want to repeat that right now because obviously it's all on the record, and I don't think it adds anything more to the discussion here. What I can say is this. If we are to look at anything in terms of a silver lining from this awful situation that took place, is that it's a cautionary tale. And you've heard, I believe, from our colleagues at Air Canada and WestJet yesterday talk about a holistic, system-wide approach to ensuring that these sorts of things are avoided in the future. I mean, one thing that you have to understand is this. Just putting out an obligation or a penalty or a fine and saying, if you don't disembark your passengers after certain hours, you're going to pay this amount of money. That would not have helped those passengers that evening. I can assure you that, because we don't need a financial incentive or threat to do what we're doing. Our crews want to get those people where they're going as quickly and as safely as possible. What happened here was a system that broke down in terms of communications, in terms of central coordination. When an airplane is at 35,000 feet going 600 miles an hour, well, the captain and his crew are basically in control of the situation, with air traffic control, of course. Once that airplane full of people lands on a piece of pavement at an airport, it's a whole different ecosphere. Now we're talking about all sorts of intermediaries and service providers running all over the place. Usually that works well in normal circumstances. I call it the symphony, when the plane pulls up to the gate and, the trucks come in, the fuelers and the baggage handlers. But when things go wrong, like they did in Toronto, and the whole thing is in complete meltdown, well, then we need a plan. We need somebody to conduct that symphony right now, and we respectfully suggest that should be the airport. And
I'm going to just jump in because I'm short on time. Just having heard you say you need a plan. Now, I can recognize that's not the norm. I actually used to take Air Transat to England when I was studying there all the time. But so we have, because of situations like that, introduced amendments and C-49, and I'd like to know how Air Transat is actually going to move in regards of implementation of C-49.
Well, we're going to work with yourselves. We're going to work with the CTA in the regulatory process. And, we will abide by what the ultimate verdict is in terms of the regulation. The devil is in the details, if you don't mind that expression, but clearly we're working with enabling legislation here. And as long as the high-level principles are agreed, well, we'll work with the CTA to come up with a balanced framework that improves the customer experience.
Okay, and I think I'm going to give you an opportunity to discuss. I know you were mentioning joint ventures. Mm-hmm. If you can just reiterate some of your remarks that you mentioned.
Cool. Okay. Well, as I mentioned in response to Ms. Bloch's question, we have to understand that, I was with a bunch of American lawyers this morning at the American Bar Association's Aerospace Law Forum in Montreal before I drove over here, and they were talking. They had a panel on competition law and aviation and concentration, in their market in the U.S. And in the U.S., it is absolutely a given that if anybody asks for immunity from the application of antitrust laws in the U.S., airline joint ventures, as they've done there, well, at a minimum, the government has to ensure that they have a comprehensive open skies policy to make sure that that joint venture is being disciplined, if you will, through market forces, competition, and thus the consumer is provided another level of protection. Well, that's not necessarily the case here in Canada. Canada has some great open agreements with many countries, but we also have restricted agreements with many network competitors that can compete with the JV here in Canada, Atlantic Plus Plus. So I tell you this, if you get immunity from competition law, and at the same time you get protection from vigorous competition that's supposed to protect the consumer, well, you've just had your cake and your chocolate chip cookies and your ice cream and you got to eat it. And we're suggesting that's not what public policy should be about here.
Thank you very much.